I can hear that the discussions are bubbling here and inspiration is flowing and light bulbs flashing and cogwheels turning. It's all great. I have the pleasure to introduce our discussants of the day. Has had the tough task to summarize what we're up to and asking what of all this can be taken forward for policy and practice. So Bette Chambers, Professor Bette Chambers, who is Director of the Institute for Effective Education at the University of York, who is a prominent, well-respected member in the policy circles in the UK. Her current focus is on evaluating educational programs that promote the use of technology and collaborative learning to enhance educational outcomes for young children. So the floor is yours, Bette.
Thank
you. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Lars. When I have gone through all of the emotions that you outlined in your talk, when Rob invited me to come and talk here, first of all, I was proud that I got invited. I had enjoyment. Everything was lovely. And then I got the papers. And then I started to get anxious because I'm not an expert in that field, and I started to worry, and then I got angry that I said yes, that I would come to this thing. And then I got here, and I listened to the speeches, and then I got interested, and I got motivated, and I'm sure on the train when I feel home, I will feel relieved. But in all of that, I never felt bored. So I guess that's a good thing. That's a good thing. I'd like to know just a little bit who I'm speaking to. Can you raise your hand if you are a student? Oh, lots and lots of students. Can you raise your hand if you're a teacher? Good. And can you raise your hand if you're both? Ah, that's great. There's lots of people who are both. Well, that's good, because then you'll be able to identify with what I'm talking about. And how about the others of you? Are there any people who are just researchers here? Yeah, that's good. That's good. Teaching and researching, yes, very good. There are several issues that I want to point out, and because some of them overlapped, I'm not going to pick too much on particular things. But I guess the thing that I would say, because even though I'm an educational psychologist, it's amazing how varied our field is in education. And my bottom line taking away from here is we really need to talk to each other more and do more of these kinds of presentations, because you really learn a lot about different ways of looking at what's going on in your field. And so I think that this is really a good thing to do. So, and I was really relieved when I heard that I was supposed to be talking about policy and practice instead of critically analyzing the methodological approaches for the statistical analyses, because that's not my area of expertise too. But I do have a lot of experience in different aspects of education and where the theories come from. And several people here, when you were talking about the emotions and the different factors, a lot of it reminded me of attribution theory, and about how in attribution theory, people's motivations and to what they attribute their success or failure determine a lot their behavior and their emotions and how they feel about things. And they divide them in many ways, and these are just two of the different factors that they use. And one of them is whether my success is controllable or uncontrollable. Is whether I succeed, is that something within my control? Is it because I work hard, because I expend a lot of effort? Or is it because I'm unlucky? Or whether it's because the teacher is not a very good teacher? Or whether I'm lucky or the teacher is a good teacher. So those will influence how you feel about you feel about how you're doing as a student, and both as a teacher as well. If I think my students aren't learning because I'm a lousy teacher, then it's going to be different than if I think that they're incorrigible students. And then there are also stable factors and unstable factors. If I think that as a student that I'm not succeeding because I have low ability, that's very different than if I think it's because I'm not trying hard enough. Because I can change how hard I'm trying, and the same for a teacher too. If the teacher thinks that the students aren't learning because she's not teaching something well enough, because she's not as prepared, then she can become better prepared and work harder. Whereas if she just thinks it's because she's a bad teacher, then she's less likely to have control over that. So all of these things, and some of them are conscious and some of them are unconscious. Some of you may have read Daniel Kahneman's book about thinking fast and slow. And he divides how we're thinking into intuitive kinds of thoughts versus conscious thoughts. And so much of what we do is unconscious. And so I just want us to be alert to that, because when we're doing these studies and we're having students do diaries or think alouds or self-reflection, that very often what they write or what they report is not really what is happening. It's just what they think is happening, or they may be thinking it's what you want to hear is happening. And so I think we have to be really, really careful when we're using those and reporting them, that we're reporting that, they're very clear that this is just what the students said, or this is what the teachers said they were doing and why they were doing it, rather than what might have actually been happening. So there's lots of stuff that's going on about that. In terms of, there's also lots of work going on right now in neuroscience. And there are these, we're doing a study right now on uncertain rewards. And these are where students are studying. They get points for when they've answered questions right in class. And then they can take their points, and in one condition, they take their points and they game those points. They bet them, they bet their points, and they get more points if they win and if they don't. And apparently what happens is just that uncertainty, that chance, that participating in the chance, whether you win or not, releases dopamine, and you remember it better. So there's just so many things that are going on right now. There's also doing work on degeneration, that when somebody's studying something, and I know this happens to me more and more, and I think it does happen to people more and more because of technology and all of the multiple distractions we have, is that it's hard to concentrate. And you're studying and you're reading something, and then your mind wanders off and it degenerates. But apparently, if you're doing some gaming kind of thing, it doesn't degenerate, because you're focused more, because you've got this, this game, this chance. So it makes you more focused on what you're doing, even though you don't even know that that's happening. So there's just all of these unconscious things that I think we need to keep in mind when we're studying motivations and that students have or not. One thing I wanted to talk about, because I thought that there was going to be more here about technology, about the effects of technology and using technology to collect data. We have been doing studies on electronic response devices and getting students to give immediate feedback or immediate answers. They get answer questions immediately, and this is in primary school. And then They get immediate feedback on their little handheld device or their iPhone, whichever you're using now. The technology is going so fast that now they're using iPads and they're getting this feedback. But that feedback is just, that immediate feedback is so critical in correcting misconceptions early on. Because before, kids would do worksheets and then they would hand them in, the teachers would take them home, they would mark them, and a few days later, a few weeks later, sometimes in university, I think it's weeks later, they would get their tests back, and then they would find out. By that time, the misconceptions are more deeply embedded, and so they're less likely to learn from them. With this thing called questions for learning, the kids get immediate feedback. Not only that, the teacher sees on his or her on her computer screen an immediate pattern of a table that has the questions and the kids' names, so they can immediately see how every child is answering each question as they go along. So if they see that a child is getting several questions wrong, they can go over and help that child immediately and nip that misconception in the bud too. Or they can get if several kids are zooming along and they're answering all the questions faster than the other kids, they can get them to go and help the kids that might be struggling. So I think that in the work that some of you were reporting on today, that these kinds of things could be really critical, because you could also be getting the kids' emotions while they're failing, while they're struggling with these tests, and then immediately you can correlate their achievement with their emotions, and oh my gosh, you could go crazy with analyses. Let's see. Oh, the other thing, another thing that I want to mention about the technology is embedded multimedia. And this just comes from students being engaged and actively engaged. There's lots of work that's been done on passive versus active engagement by learners. And the more active they are, usually, the better. And usually, when people are having kids just watch videos, it's usually quite passive. But the work of Richard Mayer at Berkeley has done a lot on looking at engagement with both using your visual and your auditory pathways, and you've got this dual encoding. And when students are watching a video that they then engage with in some way, in a more interactive way, they learn better too. So, for instance, when you're teaching beginning reading in primary school, there's a program that has these little video vignettes, and they're little cartoon kind of things. They're very short, about 30 seconds. And the little character is making some sound that is the sound represented by the shape. So you've got a caterpillar that goes k, 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 and forms himself into a C. Of course, he's chewing something that then falls down and he collapses. So there's always some sort of calamity or calamity at the end. But because it's that engaging thing, the kids are sitting there and the kids are watching the video and they're going k, 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 so that they're learning the sounds too. And then it gets more deeply embedded because they're actively engaged and they've seen this audio-visual representation too. So I think that using those multiple pathways to the brain, I think, are things that we should be thinking about when we're looking at, also again, looking at the emotions, looking at encoding things, and then looking at how individuals are perceiving these. Because I'm not going to show Catel's box. But I think you all got the picture of that. And so some of you were saying, never aggregate. Well, I guess my position would be, if you only want to generalize to individuals in individual situations, then I would agree, never aggregate. But if you want to generalize, and especially in education, and you're wanting to talk about teachers or teaching to students, I think you should always aggregate. So I'm going to be a little bit contentious there. But what I couldn't understand, because I'm not really a methodologist, is I couldn't understand when you were talking, Reinhard, about aggregating. I don't know how you aggregate students having looked at their individual work versus just going and looking at the means across. So that's something that I think, if we can communicate that in plain English, then that would be, it would really help the field to think about, because if there is a way, it would be great to know that, because those processes are really important. And they're not just important to researchers, which is a really good thing. They're important to policymakers. They're important. Who they're really important to is developers of educational interventions. Because when you're developing an intervention, that's when the time when you need to do the intra-individual research. Because you need to see, okay, if I'm having, say the intervention is teaching science. And I know that inquiry-based learning is all wonderful and everything. And people are always pushing to do inquiry-based learning. But if you are doing, say you're developing a method, and you have the students engaged in the inquiry before they're exposed to any of the language or the terms or the basic concepts, then that might not be a good thing. So if you could try out your intervention with a small number of students and do that intra-individual work to see, okay, what happens? When should the inquiry kick in? Do we need to do some basic, just straight, stand-up teaching beforehand? Or is there some other way that the children should learn those basic skills before they get into doing the experimentation or the inquiry? Or can you do the inquiry right from the beginning? And you could try out different ways to see how individuals work before you go crazy and develop the whole thing. This is what happens. I don't know about in the other countries that you come from. But here, what policymakers do is they make the policy, they disseminate the policy throughout the whole country, and then they evaluate it, sometimes. Instead of trying it out in pilot places, I think they are starting to learn a little bit, trying it out in pilot places, evaluating it, and then if it works, spreading it out, or learning from how it worked and spread out a variation of the intervention. Okay. I really liked your question, Jan, about why does research on learning and instruction often have so little impact on teachers and teaching, and why does research on teaching and teacher education have so little impact on student learning? And I have spent my whole career asking those same questions. It's very important because there is so much work that's been done on student learning. And any basic education psychology text tells you how the features of instruction that help students learn, things like pacing, things like having advanced organizers, things like cooperative learning, things like, being explicit about the objectives. I mean, there are so many detailed things that go into good teaching, and yet you don't see it very often. and that's really frustrating. As a teacher educator, as an education researcher, it's really frustrating how much weak teaching there is out there and how little we have to learn from that. So, and there's so little research that's been on teacher professional development, and so I'm really glad to see that this is picking up more, and it is really, really key. But a good place to start would be looking at what works for students, and then applying that to what works in teacher professional development. Because if something works for teacher professional development, then that works with students, maybe teachers are more likely to generalize and use that in their teaching. Or is that just a vain hope? It might just be a vain hope. Anyway, Jan, I was really interested in the lesson study, and I wondered if you didn't get time to tell us about that, but I wondered if you might do that just a little bit, because I think that there's also an Education Endowment Foundation study on lesson learning, and it's really a hot topic here. Oh, okay, we've only got 5 minutes, so you can have 3 of them. Yeah.
Well, just shortly then, lesson study is a way of professional development originated in Japan, very much from teachers themselves, so there were no educational scientists developing the model. It has been done there for over 100 years, and it comes down essentially that teachers in very small groups analyze their lessons with a focus on student learning. They plan their next lesson, a kind of research lesson, in which they experiment with new methods of teaching, very specifically focus on content as well. And then one of the teachers gives the lesson, and the other 2 teachers observe during the lesson with a specific focus on case pupils, as I say, certain case pupils. And afterwards, they come together, they discuss how it went, not in general terms, but especially how those 3 case pupils misunderstood or understood, let's say, the mathematical content of that specific lesson. And it's gaining enormously fast popularity all over the world. I've been in Indonesia in November. There was a world conference on lesson study. People really from all over the world doing it. It seems to be very popular with teachers, but it's also, I think, through the focus on student learning. That's why I find it interesting, from my interest in combining teaching and student learning. It's a very interesting way. And the Japanese have, they not only observe with 2 teachers, but they, for example, have public lessons where there are 100 teachers observing actually what a specific teacher is doing. So very, very
That's great, that's great.
We are researching it now in London because the Mayor of London has initiated this project on lesson study with mathematical teachers. We're trying to analyze the videos for signals of teacher learning. Yeah.
And you are going to be looking at student outcomes, though, right?
Yes, that's the idea.
Good,
so,
good. Not just teachers' perceptions of student outcomes. That's good, that's good. Because I was dismayed but not surprised to hear your statistic that only 14% of the studies had looked at actual student outcomes. And really, I guess my final thought is that education is an applied field, and we should be here to try and improve the field. And so as much as possible, if you can translate your findings into plain English and getting teachers to listen, and educators and people in the policy world to listen to what you're finding, then I think that would be a huge step forward, because I think we're all in here to try and improve education for children in the world. Anyway, thanks. Thank you.